All right, so now we are going to discuss the case against compensating for human organs, such as the kidney. Now, one of the first points that's made in this reading is that those who endorse compensation for organs either implicitly or explicitly accept some view of the body or the person or the self, such that, well, some will treat the self as an embodiment or an embodied self and thus not distinct but identical to the body. And other people will treat the self as being distinct from the body, and the body as being a kind of thing that's owned, a sort of property that the self owns. So these are two different ways in which we might think about the relationship between one's self and one's body. The first says, I'm an embodied self, meaning like I'm in some sense identical to my body. And the other view says that no, I am distinct from my body. I might have like a soul, or maybe I've got some other sort of mental properties or mental substances, such that I, as a self, can own my body. My body is property, it belongs to me. So these are just two different ways in which philosophers oftentimes distinguish between our relationship to ourselves and our bodies. And so, what we might say is that, well, how we think about this particular distinction will make a difference with regard to what we say about the morality of organ acquisition. So, that's the first point that I want you to keep in mind as we're proceeding through the different arguments with regard to the case against compensation for human organs. So, whether one accepts the embodiment view or the property view, one can say that an individual's right to do what they want with their body might be taken to imply that one has a right to dispose of one's body parts, such as being compensated for one's kidneys. So, that looks like it's going to be true no matter which view you take. However, what the proponent of compensation for organ acquisitions will actually say is that there's three different consequences that will follow. The first is that compensation for one's kidneys is actually no different from other, presumably morally permissible forms of bodily commodification. The second says that it's actually hypocritical to prohibit the sale of something like one's kidneys, given that you would be willing to participate and do that if you were in that situation. And the third says, well, given the fact that so many people die waiting for an organ transplant, then it's just morally wrong not to do everything we possibly can to make organ transplantation more available to those who need it. Again, this is the basic intuition that we began with in the first lecture. So the proponent of compensating for organ transplants will oftentimes offer some version of one of these three arguments. And so we're going to have to keep in mind these three different positions as we proceed in order to try to show why the opponent of compensating for organ transplants will try and show why they don't work. Now, we also want to keep in mind that the reason opponents of commodification object is that it seems that this would lead to an even greater objectification of the human body. And insofar as it's thought that the objectification of the human body is not a good thing, a morally permissible thing to do, then that would be a reason to object to the commodification with regard to human organs. But proponents have a reply here, right? Proponents could say that selling one's organ is not any different in kind from other forms of commercialization, such as the selling of one's labor or commercial surrogate motherhood, other kinds of risky jobs that you might think of a coal miner, let's say, and perhaps even in the case of someone like a sex worker. And so if we think that these sort of risky behaviors are morally permissible, even though they involve a kind of commodification of the human body, well, then we should allow for the selling of human organs as well, out of respect for a kind of consistency. But now the opponents have a response too. The opponent should respond in the following way. Well, just because there are some similarities between, say, prostitution or some other form of risky behavior, or some form of risk taking, well, that does not imply that all forms of risk taking is morally permissible, right? Consider someone who works as a miner. That seems to be a risky job. If we say that working conditions for a miner is exploitative and objectionable, then the right thing to do is to work to make these conditions better, not to expand the range of dangerous jobs that are permissible or other forms of risky behavior that would be permissible, right? We should make the conditions for the miner better, not allow for more risky behaviors. Now, there's another interesting point to keep in mind here. It turns out that opponents of selling of human organs differ in the context of cadaver donations. A cadaver donation would be the kind of donation involving a brain dead person, where you were to take a kidney or a lung or maybe some skin samples or what have you from someone who's brain dead. So those who argue against the compensation of transplant organs, they actually differ with regard to this type of a donation. Now, those who accept some form of the body as self or an embodiment type view will tend to argue against any form of commodification in the case of cadaver donations, right? However, those who accept the body as property view, those who tend to think that the body is something that can be owned, well, they tend to allow for incentives that would encourage donations in a case like this. So I think you can start to see how which view you take with regard to the body. Is the body something that's owned, or are you identical to your body? Whatever view you take there might influence what you have to say about the compensation for human organs. But why is that? Let's dig a little bit deeper and try to figure out why that is. Well, it turns out that the key point of contention is the question whether death immediately ends the body as self connection and opens the door to the application of property concerns and the logic of commodities, since the person is no longer there. Who owns the material body and how much may they profit from its disposition, right? So the question of whether or not the brain dead person still owns their body, what you have to say about that will depend upon whether or not the brain dead person is identical to their body, or if you think that the brain dead person just owns their body. And since they are now brain dead, then that opens the door to using the body, since they can no longer own it, they're brain dead. Well, that body then can be used in whatever way to save other people's lives. And so it does seem as though what view you take with regard to the relationship between the self and the body will influence what you have to say about some of these cases. And the question is not whether the biological death of the body is sort of immediately means that there's a kind of a disembodiment and transfer of ownership of the body, at least with regard to those who are responsible for honoring one's wishes. There still seems to be some kind of connection involved with ownership of the body here, at least with regard to those who are responsible for honoring one's wishes. It does seem to be that there is some kind of ownership of one's body. It's not as if nobody owns the body once death happens. Once there's an immediate disembodiment, it's not as if it just transfers over to the state. There still might be people who are responsible for honoring one's wishes after they've died. And what about the cultural and the social implications involved with death? It does seem to be the case that in many cultures and in many social institutions, there are all sorts of ways in which one's body is still very, very important in that culture or in that social institution. Think about different religious views, or think about how the military honors their dead. And so you might think that it's just a basic human recognition that our self, our identity, exists in the space of social relations, and that the ongoing flow of social life necessitates a gradual disengagement of the deceased from the ties to the living that constituted the social self. So I think the idea here is, even when a person's dead, even if they're brain dead, that doesn't necessarily mean that their body no longer is owned in some particular way. There are social and cultural elements involved, such that our identity does continue to exist in some sense, at least within the space of social influences or social relations. That's one way in which we can think about this particular argument.